So yeah, what we were talking about last week, and we barely got into it. And so I'm going to do a bit of a review, and then we'll start kind of back a little bit from where we left off. And the idea here is that there's a forbidden chapter, not forbidden for Christians, but forbidden for Jews, essentially forbidden. It's a chapter that is really discouraged for Jews to read. And that's because it is very messianic in its nature. It really describes Jesus, and everything we see about Jesus in the New Testament fulfills that. We're going to be looking at here. We're going to be working through Isaiah 53, that chapter, verse by verse. And we're also going to look at the modern Jewish understanding of Isaiah 53. And we talked last week that they don't teach that chapter in any place in Judaism. Pretty much no synagogue ever touches that topic. And they discourage the reading of it. If anybody is reading it, they're told you shouldn't be reading that. It'll just confuse you. You can't understand that without having special understanding. And the reason is that they try to interpret that as being about Israel and not about Jesus. And because of that, um, it's not a satisfactory interpretation. If you really try to go through all of Isaiah 53, thinking that it doesn't line up very well with what Isaiah 53 is saying. It really is talking about a man who is dying for the sins of others, and nowhere did Israel ever die for the sins of anybody. So it's not a good interpretation, and so largely they try to keep people from reading it or bringing it up for discussion. And that viewpoint is relatively modern. We looked last week at a person, a Jewish sage, a person who is well studied in Judaism. We looked at the Rambam and also some older sages, and they all interpreted this passage, Isaiah 53, as being about the Messiah. And we'll see some words from him in particular about that, showing that he sees that as being a messianic description. But the Rambam does not think that Jesus is the Messiah. He thinks that the Messiah is different from what Jesus was. And we'll see that also in some words from the Rambam that we'll be looking at. So, and we're also going to look at New Testament quotations. The New Testament quotes very heavily from Isaiah all over the place, and especially from Isaiah 53. So it has quite a bit to say about Isaiah 53, because we can look at how it's used in the New Testament, and we can see how the apostles understood what was said in Isaiah 53. Because there are passages in Isaiah 53 that aren't really as clear as we would like them to be. And so we'll see New Testament usages of them that help us to understand how the apostles understood Isaiah 53, the parts that they quote. So that's where we're going today. And so starting here, this is Isaiah 52, which is actually the lead-in, the beginning of 53. So there's a few verses here. We covered this part last week, but we'll go over this again. So Isaiah 52, verse 13 is where we'll start. And it says, "Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted." And so that really sounds like a person. That doesn't sound like Israel, a nation. But in any case, there are lots of statements like that that don't seem to line up with the Jewish idea that this is about Israel. And so, verse 14, "Just as many were astonished at you, my people, so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men." And so we understand what's being talked about there. We know that Jesus at his crucifixion was whipped and probably given the 40 whipping maximum that was given at that time. And then after that, he was crucified. Remember how that worked. Pilate said, "This man has done nothing worth of crucifixion, so I'll just have him whipped and let him go." So he whipped him and said to the people, "Okay, I've whipped him, I'm going to let him go." And they said, "No, crucify him." So he got whipped and crucified, whereas most other people who were going to be crucified were just crucified. So he was marred more than any other man, and his form more than the sons of men. So we know that Jesus was mistreated beyond what was normal, and that's what that's talking about there. Now in verse 15, it says, "Thus he will sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths, for what had not been told them they will see, and what they had not heard they will understand." So there's a number of things being said there. I mentioned the sprinkling, and we talked about that last week, and probably somebody here, anybody who was here at that time, can tell me what sprinkling means or what it's referring to. Martha was here, and she talked about that.
With his blood? With his blood?
Yes. Yeah. When you look at the word sprinkle that's used here in all of the Old Testament, 90% of it is referring to sprinkling with blood. And then there's a few that are sprinkling with water, and then there's one that's sprinkling with myrrh or something like that. I forgot what it was, but primarily it's always about blood. And so, when did you sprinkle blood in the Old Testament? Well, you sprinkled it in two cases. One was as part of a sacrifice, and the other one as part of setting up a new covenant. And so when the old covenant was set up, all of the people were sprinkled with the ox blood that was sacrificed. And so that sprinkling here is what's being referred to. And so it's really saying, when it says sprinkle, it's saying a new covenant is coming. You're going to be sprinkled into a new covenant. And as the book of Hebrews says, no covenant is settled without blood being spilled. And also notice that it says many nations. So this is not just about Israel. So it's talking about he's going to sprinkle many nations. So this is going to be a covenant that's going to introduce the Gentiles into it. And we know that that's what Christianity is. No longer is there Jew and Gentile. There's just one people. So, and it also says kings will shut their mouths. And if you think about that one, that's not too hard to figure out what's being said there. Because when a king in his court spoke, you shut up. Because if the king didn't like you speaking, the king would have your head removed. And so what they're saying here is that when a king shuts his mouth, then there's somebody above him who is speaking, and he accepts that this person is above him. So we're talking about a king of kings that's being talked about here, and we know that that's what Jesus was. And now it says, what had not been told them, they will see, and what they had not heard, they will understand. And the question that you come up with here is, who is them? Who is they? And that's not clear, but we're going to see how this verse gets used in the New Testament, and it'll become clear from that. Next. So this is Romans 15:22. Paul is quoting Isaiah 52:15 that we just looked at. And he says, while I take pains to preach the good news, not where the name of the Messiah is invoked, lest I build on an unusual foundation. But just as it is written, those who had not been told about him shall see him, and those who have not heard shall be convinced. Because of this, I was hindered many times when I would have come to you. So Paul sees himself as being the fulfillment of that prophecy in the work that he does. So he is saying he was the apostle to the Gentiles, right? And so that was his focus. And so he was taking the message, the good news message, out to the apostles. And so that's what he's talking about, is that Isaiah 52:15 is the they and the them that we saw there is talking about Gentiles, not Jews. And so he's specifically saying that he's one of the people fulfilling that. And he also says there that he did not preach where the Messiah was already known, which was the Jews. And he didn't preach to them because he would have been building on an unusual foundation because of their misunderstandings of who the Messiah was going to be. And we'll bump into that a little bit later on here. He didn't want to build on that foundation about the Messiah because they had so many misunderstandings of what the Messiah was going to be. And so he took his message straight to the Gentiles who knew nothing about the Messiah. Okay, so back to Isaiah 53 now. And in Isaiah 53, that chapter begins with, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. So he has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. This is commonly quoted. And what is it saying?
Regular person.
Regular person. He doesn't look at anything special. And even more than that, he doesn't look at anything special. There's no reason that you would be attracted to him. Nothing about him would draw you to him, except his words, of course, but nothing in his physical appearance would do that. And so, but it also goes and talks about a tender shoot, like a root out of parched ground. And we talked about that a bit last week, and I'll do that again. You've probably got tree roots in your lawn. I know that I do. A root that kind of comes up just to the surface, and then all of a sudden it'll be sitting there for a year or two, and all of a sudden it'll pop out a little shoot and try to start growing something up from this root that's been hanging there for a while. And the meaning behind this, we'll see in a New Testament reference to this, but the meaning behind it is that he has no genealogy. He just comes out of nowhere and he doesn't have a significant family. And we'll actually see the Rambam talking about that. Okay, so the New Testament references to those verses come here. The first one is from John chapter 12. And he says, whereas he did all these miracles before them, they did not trust in him, that the word of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which says, my Lord, who is believing our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord Yahweh revealed? Therefore, they were not able to believe. So how John understands this, the Apostle John understands this, the question that was asked in Isaiah 53 was a questioning of that there wouldn't be that many people who believed in Jesus and believed in his message. And so it's questioning that when it says, who is believing our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord Yahweh revealed? And the arm of the Lord means his strength and his power being revealed. And so that's what's being questioned here is how many people, a small number of people are going to be all that are going to trust in the Messiah and believe in him. And the other New Testament verse that quotes that is coming from Romans 10. And this is Paul again. So, but not all have submitted to the message of the gospel. As Isaiah said, my Lord, who believes our report? So he just chops that down to that little part of that Isaiah 53 verse 1. And he says, therefore, faith is from the hearing ear, and the hearing ear is from the word of God. So he says there are very few people who are hearing the message, really hearing and believing the message. And he says that faith comes from having a hearing ear, an ear that can hear. And Jesus used that phrase quite a few times. He said, eyes that can see, ears that can hear. And so he means really perceive and not be in blindness, really hear and not be deaf. And so he says, for those people that have that hearing ear, they're able to hear the word of God coming from Jesus, and they were able to accept that. But there were a large number who didn't, is the implication. And therefore they had no faith, and it wasn't possible for them to believe and accept the Messiah.
This is very different from a lot of televangelists today. They want to be the main focus.
Mm-hmm.
They want to be the attraction. Their flamboyance, the way they behave, the way they dress, all of that to attract people to them personally. But Yeshua was not like that at all.
Right.
He didn't want anybody to look at him or to think about him. He could have come out as the most beautiful angel there ever was, but no, that was not what it's about. It was his message that counted and the work that he had to do on earth.
Yeah. And we talked about that last week. That verse really says how important it is to us, how people look. And so easily swayed we are by a person who looks good, presents himself well, speaks well, uses words craftily in his messages. And those are not the things that we should be looking for. And that really kind of takes us back to King David when he was chosen. Or Saul, I should say, when he was chosen, he was head over everybody else and was a fine looking man and all those sorts of things, all of the things that the world looks for. But that's not at all what Jesus was going to be like, and not what we should look for. We should try to look for the inner person and not the outer things. Okay, so the Rambam talks about that verse too, and he uses it as a definition of who the Messiah will be. And so he's talking about who the Messiah be in this letter to Yemen. The Messiah is not a person concerning whom it may be predicted that he will be the son of so-and-so or of the family of so-and-so. On the contrary, he will be unknown before his coming, but he will prove by means of miracles and wonders that he is the true Messiah. In allusion to his mysterious lineage, God says, behold, a man whose name is Shoot, and who shall shoot up. That's Zechariah he's quoting from. Similarly, Isaiah, referring to his arrival, implies that neither his father nor mother nor his kith and kin will be known, for he will grow by his favor like a sapling, like a root out of arid ground. And that's from Isaiah. And so the Rambam, and remember we talked about him last week, he's from the 1100s, the years 1130 or so, somewhere in there. And he was probably the last of the sages who believed that this passage was a messianic description. He didn't accept the idea that Israel was who's being talked about in Isaiah 53. There were other people in his time who believed that this passage was talking about Israel, but he didn't accept that. And so the Rambam is doing the same thing that we should do and do in these lessons, is we put together different pieces of scripture that are talking about the same thing and get a bigger picture by putting those together. And so here he understands that Jesus will not come from a significant person or a significant family. In doing so, he establishes Isaiah 53 as being a description of the Messiah. So he's saying Isaiah 53:2 is talking about the Messiah, as Zechariah is also talking about that. And so we see right there that the Rambam accepts that Isaiah 53 is a messianic description. Continuing on with what the Rambam says, and this is referring to Isaiah 52:15. It says, "Then the kings will neither defame nor calumniate him, for the miracles he will perform will frighten them into complete silence." Isaiah refers to the submission of the kings to him in the verse, "Kings shall be silenced because of him." So again, he's quoting that Isaiah passage as a messianic passage, but he's beginning to make a mistake here. We're going to see this again. In Judaism, the Jews at Jesus' time were expecting a different kind of Messiah than they got. They were looking for a conquering king, and they didn't understand that there was going to be a suffering servant who came first. And there were some people who saw the suffering servant here in Isaiah, and others who saw the conquering king. And they figured that when the Messiah came, he would be first the suffering servant and then the conquering king. And so they believed that he wasn't going to die. And so that's part of why they don't accept that Jesus was the Messiah, is that they see these two suffering servant and conquering king things happening with the same person in the same time. And so they didn't realize that these were going to be very distant events in time, and they still don't accept that. They still think that the conquering king and suffering servant are both descriptions of the Messiah that comes. Although, in fact, there are some people in Judaism who believe, who ask the question, are there really two Messiahs? Is there one who's the suffering servant Messiah and one who's the conquering king Messiah? And they come at the same time, and so there's really two Messiahs rather than one. And so Judaism is struggling with questions like that, but we know the answer already, that we've seen the suffering servant and we're waiting for the conquering king. And so, as I said, this also was a characteristic of people in Jesus' time. He wasn't what they were expecting him to be. And probably the reason behind that is that they didn't recognize that the Messiah would be God. They were expecting the Messiah to be just a man. And because of that, they expected in one lifetime he would have to do all of these, he would have to fulfill all these messianic prophecies. And so to do that, he would have to have been both the suffering servant and the conquering king. And perhaps one first and then the other. They didn't exactly understand how that was going to work. And so this is the foundation that Paul talked about, this weird foundation of the Messiah that he didn't want to preach on because it was so messed up like this. And it would have been the first thing he would have had to have done to preach to Jews is to first tell them, okay, everything you thought about the Messiah is wrong, and let's start over again. And he knew that that wouldn't be well received. Okay, so continuing on with what the Rambam says. This is from a different quote of his, a different document. And it says, "If a king will arise from the house of David, who occupies himself with the study of the Torah and the performance of the mitzvos," that's the laws, "like David his ancestor, in accordance with the written law and the oral law, and if he will compel all of Israel to follow the Torah and strengthen its observance, and if he will fight the wars of God, then he is assumed to be the Messiah. If he does these things and it is successful, and he builds the temple on its place and gathers in the exiles of Israel, then he is definitely the Messiah." So you see what they've done here. They've taken a whole bunch of prophecies and lumped them all together into one person. And they said, he has to do all of these things. He has to, now they've decided he's going to occupy himself with study of Torah because that's what the sages did. But that wasn't what Jesus was doing. He already knew the Torah because he was the author of the Torah. And so he didn't have to do that. But they're understanding that their Messiah would have to be occupied with the study of the Torah. And so that's what they were expecting, because that's kind of how they live their own lives. And he talks about the written law and the oral law. Now, the written law is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The oral law is the stuff that the Jews have added on top of that. The priests and the scribes and all those other people added things to that. And Jesus fought against those things, those oral law additions, especially those oral law additions that were contradicting what the written law of God was saying. And so, but because oral law is very important to Judaism, these people are expecting that he would support both the written law and the oral law. But we know that Jesus didn't support that. And also they expect that he would compel all of Israel to follow the Torah. But that's not what Jesus was about. He wasn't there about compelling anybody to do anything. He was trying to draw them to him and to righteousness itself. And also they expect that he's going to fight the wars of God. Now, like I said, the conquering king references in prophecy are all there, and that's what he's referring to. He's expecting that this person is going to do these conquering king things, and that they are prophesied. And so he says that if he does those things, then he can be assumed to be the Messiah. And then he says if he does these other things and is successful in doing them, and he talks about he builds the temple on its place. Now remember, we talked about Ezekiel's temple a long, long time ago now, and Ezekiel describes in about 9 chapters all the details of this temple that's going to be built in the future. And so that's what they're referring to here, is they expect the Messiah to build this temple and gather in all the exiles of Israel, because there are all prophecies about those sort of things. And so they're expecting all of this to be done by one man, that will be the Messiah, and so he's going to do all these things. So you can see how they're expecting things of the Messiah that aren't going to happen. And so when they see Jesus and look at what Jesus did, they say, well, no, he couldn't possibly be the Messiah because he died and he didn't do all of these things. And so that's the problem that Israel is having right now, is that they've misunderstood who the Messiah is going to be and they're expecting something else. Okay, one last set of quotes from the Rambam. And that continues on from what we had in the last slide. It says, if he did not succeed to this extent, or he was killed, then we know that he is certainly not the one promised by the Torah. He is like all the kings of the house of David, who were honorable and upright, who died. God did not cause him to arise except to test the people. As it says, some of the wise will stumble in order to purify them until the end, because it is not yet the time. So he's referring to Daniel 11 there, and Daniel 11 is talking about future prophecies. But he's actually, without saying it, he's talking about Jesus here. He says he was killed. And so right away he says, if he was killed like Jesus was, we know that he's not the Messiah, because he doesn't line up with what we're expecting him to do. And he also says, if he does die, then he was only there to test the people and to make as someone who was a false Messiah that would draw them away. And Daniel warns about false messiahs, and he said there are going to be false messiahs. And Jesus did the same thing. He talked about false messiahs coming. So he says Jesus was really just a test of the people of Israel as a false messiah, to make sure that they wouldn't be deceived and follow after this false messiah. So you can see the major error there. They've expected something wrong about the Messiah. They won't accept what really happened in Jesus' time, because they've just kind of made up their mind, and they won't listen to anything else. So in summary, what the Rambam says is that Isaiah 53 is a description of the Messiah, but Jesus wasn't that Messiah because he died.
And then they had to skip over, but he rose again. And how many men have died and risen again? That's, they can't, rule that out at all.
Yeah, they do anyway.
Yeah.
People, I've said it so many times, people believe what they want to believe.
But like other historians like Josephus, he confirmed that he was risen, that this man had died and was risen again, and he was not really a particular religious man, but he was a historian, and he did a lot of interviews and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And he said, there's a lot of witnesses, we can't just discount this, but people, as you say, they didn't believe because it just didn't believe.
Yeah. Okay, so going back to Isaiah 53 here. Continuing on with those verses, we're picking it up at verse 3. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. So in this translation, this is NASB that I'm pulling Isaiah 53 from. And it's translated the grief and the man of sorrows as grief and man of sorrows, but there are other translations who use instead pains and sickness. And And this is something we're going to see a little bit of coming up, is that there are people in Christianity who are spinning their translations. The translators are Christianizing, is a word that's sometimes used. They're Christianizing Old Testament translations to make them more understandable by Christians. And that's what's going on here. Man of Sorrows is not the best translation there, and grief is not the best translation there. And we'll see evidence of that from the New Testament quote. And so they could be, and in some translations, they are done as pains and sickness instead of man of sorrows and grief. And I've talked about chiasms before, if you remember that. And that's seems to be one thing that's going on here. You see how, let me get my pointer out. A chiasm is when you've got kind of nested phrases and they're pointing to something on the inside of those nested phrases. So what we have on the outside here, outermost, is sorrows, and here's sorrows. And then inside of that, we see grief and grief. And so that those two repetitions nested like that are often an indication that this is a chiasm and that there is something important between the word grief here and the word grief here. And so I think the important thing here, if this is a chiasm, is he was despised and we did not esteem him. So it's really saying that the Messiah was not going to be accepted. He was going to be despised and not esteemed as being what he was. Okay, so we'll New Testament references to that, and we'll see some words that'll help us to understand that pains and sickness are a better translation there. So this comes from Matthew 8, 16 and 17, and that's quoting 53:4 that we were just reading. But when it was evening, they brought many demon-possessed people before him, and he cast their demons out with a word, and all those who became ill, and he healed them, so that would be fulfilled, which was said by Isaiah the prophet, who said, he will take our pains and he will bear our sicknesses. So right there you can see that Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, sees that part of Isaiah as talking about the healings that Jesus did, casting out demons, healing them from their sicknesses, taking away their pains, those sorts of things. So that helps us to understand a little bit better and also to get a better translation of the Old Testament there. And so all of that, the pains and sicknesses that are being talked about there are talking about not spiritual things as is sometimes understood from that, but physical things, the healings that Jesus would do. Okay, back to Isaiah. Yes, we're going to be jumping back and forth a lot here. I'll try to keep you on track. Okay, so this part of Isaiah talks about he was pierced. And so the verse this is 5 and 6, but he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. Well, those are kind of critical verses there. So how can scourging one person cause another person to be healed? That's what this verse is saying. It's saying he was whipped so that we would be healed. And the imagery here is really about this sheep and all of these other things is pointing to a sacrifice. So it's really hinting at the idea that the Messiah is going to be a sacrifice, and by that sacrifice we are going to be healed. And again, we're saying, how does Judaism read anything else into that? But they do. And so the big question in this is, how can our iniquity, our sin, fall on anyone else but us? There's no place in the Old Testament that ever says that your sin can fall on someone else. No one else can die for your sin. There are only animal sacrifices set up for some kinds of sins. So there's nothing in the Bible that supports this idea that someone else's sin could fall on somebody else. But that's what the verse says here. Okay, so the New Testament reference to that comes from 1 Peter. And it says, and he took all of our sins and lifted them in his body to the cross. For as we are dead to sin, we shall live in his righteousness. For by his scars you have been healed, for you have gone astray like sheep, and you have returned now to the shepherd and the caregiver of your soul. So unlike some of the quotes that we saw before where the author actually says, I'm quoting Isaiah, he just kind of throws in the quote from Isaiah. That part about his scars you've been healed and you had gone astray like sheep is right from Isaiah 53. And so he's using that here as an encouragement for believers. He says, this was done for you, that you would be strong and be dead to sin. And he said all of these things, Jesus being lifted on in his body to the cross and taking all of our sins, are all part of what should make you strong and encourage you to continue on. Okay, so now we're back to Isaiah, having looked at the New Testament references to that earlier verse. So Isaiah 53 again, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. Lots of important things are being said there. He says, this person, and we understand that to be the Messiah, he was cut off. Now, that word cut off is interesting in Hebrew. It can mean anything from being ostracized or kicked out, maybe kicked out of the town you're in, something like that, anywhere all the way up to being executed. And so it's a wide-ranging word, and it can mean anything in that range. So you could understand this part of being cut off in different ways. But it does say, it continues off by saying, out of the land of the living. So that makes it clear that it's the kind of cutoff where you die. And so it clearly says that this person is going to be cut off out of the land of the living. And that is for the transgression of my people, that he's going to do this because of the sins of my people, Israel. And how else can you understand that? But that seems so clear there. And then it continues on by talking about Israel and saying, to whom the stroke was due. That death stroke was coming to them because of what they lived and their lives that they lived and their lack of faith in God. And he says that stroke was due to them, but instead this person was cut off out of the land of the living and took that stroke upon himself. So again there, especially there, that's one of the passages where it really seems you have to ask yourself how the Jews could come up with the idea that this is talking about Israel. When was Israel ever cut off out of the land of the living? And then it says, for the transgression of my people, which is Israel. So how could Israel have been cut off from the land of the living for my people, Israel? So you can see the weakness in the Jewish idea that this is talking about Israel. And there's also New Testament references to that. And this one comes out of Acts. And he's quoting those verses that we just looked at. And he says, but the section of scripture he read, now this is, I should give you some background here. This is Jesus while he's alive, he's being talked about while he was alive, and that he had gone in and read that particular scripture from Isaiah. And so that's what's being talked about here by the apostle in Acts. But the section of scripture that he, Jesus, read had this in it. He was led as a lamb for sacrifice, and as a ewe before its shearer is silent. Also in this way he opened not his mouth. He was led in his humility from imprisonment and from judgment. And who will narrate his time? For his life is taken from the earth. So you can see there that he's quoting directly from that. And this is the Ethiopian. Sorry, I got that wrong. This is about the Ethiopian. He's reading in his wagon as he's being taken back to his country, which was Ethiopia. And the apostle Philip meets him, if you remember that passage. And so God directs Philip to go and talk to the Ethiopian. And this is what the Ethiopian was reading in there. He was reading about Isaiah 53, talking about this person. And the Ethiopian asks Philip, who is this person he's talking about? Is this the author himself talking about himself, or is he talking about somebody else? And so Philip goes and explains all of it, and then the Ethiopian is baptized from that. So that's another place where Isaiah 53 turns up in the New Testament.
One of the biggest churches in the world is in Ethiopia, and I don't know how they prove it, but they said that they started it from this particular incident here,
Mm-hmm.
where the Ethiopian went back and he converted people, and so they couldn't figure out why they were, out of nowhere, nobody went to them,
Mm-hmm.
and they couldn't explain it, and but so they read the Bible, but They also have the Book of Enoch. They read that a lot as well.
Okay.
So it's interesting, and they swear by it. That's part of their history and all of that, and they go back to this the Book of Acts, where Philip actually
Yeah.
worked with this Ethiopian person there. He was a eunuch, right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, he's a eunuch.
Ruben, you had a question?
I'd like to add though that I think I know what happened though. According to history, two Roman scholars or two people, Roman Christian believers at the time, they got washed up on shore and they shipwrecked onto what's supposed to be, I'm gonna say Ethiopia, where two eagles actually showed up, took them aboard, and then somewhere on the line, the two Roman believers, they converted Ethiopians into be believers in Christ and everything. And they went on to found a building straight out of rock, which is the very shape of an old-fashioned cross.
Hmm.
Therefore, that church building in Egypt is around to this day.
A lot of history there, so
Yeah.
who knows how much of it is
It's correct.
religion and
I was going to say exactly that. Those stories get started, and the Catholic Church was really bad for starting stories like that. They have a story about how each and every apostle died, but there's really no historical references for that. It seems like the Catholic Church just made those up because they wanted to have a story to tell. And so we always need to be careful about what we rely on for facts and those sort of things.
Yeah, there is also a book written about the death of the disciples or the apostles. But again, I agree with you. They don't have any real basis for where they come up with.
Yeah.
They just say it like it's the gospel itself. So
That's right. Yeah, they've got nothing to quote for documents.
May I
Yeah.
read those verses previous?
Yes.
And I think in Acts 8, it says, "And behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, who had charge of all her treasury and had come to Jerusalem to worship, was returning, and sitting in his chariot, he was reading Isaiah the prophet."
Yeah.
So what religion was he? If he had come to worship, what religion do you think he was?
Well, if he came to Jerusalem to worship, he would have been a Jew. Yeah, he would have been a Jew, but an Ethiopian Jew. And the Jews did do proselytization around their area, so they must have sent people down there. So he became a Jew at that time. And so heading back there. And what Pastor Joe was talking about is kind of important here. If you ask the all-important question, why is this in the Bible, the story about the eunuch? Because it really doesn't give you anything more about the eunuch. It says, here's this eunuch, he was heading back to his home country. Philip meets with him, converts him, and then you don't hear about the eunuch ever again. And so the only reason has to be that there is a story that goes on for that. There was a purpose in God doing this and making sure that the Ethiopian was converted. And like Pastor Joe was saying, that is probably the way that the Ethiopians got Christianity. He was a significant.
They swear by it.
Yeah.
They're 100% positive about it.
Yeah.
But we weren't there. We just have to think about them.
Yeah.
Just when they work for it.
Yeah. If there was no point in it, like if he died on his way home and never even made it home, there wouldn't be a point in having this story here. And yet here it is. So it must have a purpose. Okay. Isaiah 53. Oops. I said 35. Typo. Okay. Continue on. It says, his grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in or at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. And that would be 53:9, not 35:9. So what this verse is saying is that those people who killed him intended for him to die, go to the grave with wicked men, but he was with a rich man at his death. And this is one of the verses that tends to get Christianized by a lot of translations. They're trying to make it say that he was buried in a rich man's tomb. That really isn't what it says. It just says he was with a rich man. And so the focus here is that dichotomy between they intended him to be to go to the grave along with wicked men, but at his death he was with a rich man. And so that's the real thing. It isn't really talking about him being in a rich man's grave. But it does kind of hint at that. And so what you see here in the translation here is that word in. And so it sounds like he shared a grave with a rich man. And so, but the word in is really not a good translation there. It should be at. And that's one of the things that the Jews complain about in the translations the Christians use, is that this word isn't correctly translated. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but it does make a little difference here. And so it doesn't say specifically that he's going to be in the grave of a rich man, but it does kind of hint that his grave would not be with the wicked. And so if you start with that, you say, well, if his grave is not with the wicked, then where was it? Well, now we know, but they wouldn't have known through this prophecy.
Would it be the guy who gave his tomb or his grave?
Well, that's the rich man that's being talked about. Yeah, for sure. But the verse isn't actually saying that Jesus would be buried in his tomb, just that he wouldn't be buried with wicked men. Yeah, it's a fine point. And so this next part, this last bullet on this slide, is that one of the people who's talking about the Jewish view of what Isaiah means, and so he comments about this idea there, and this is what he said. I'll read this. He says, his grave was assigned with wicked men, wherein Israel is described as cut off, and God promises to open its graves and bring Israel back into its own land. Other examples of figurative deaths are quoted in there. So he's saying what this passage really means is that Israel is going to be cut off, and God has promises in prophecy that to open their graves, and we know that that's coming from Ezekiel 37, I think, and where Ezekiel talks about the Israel coming back as a nation from dry bones. And so that's what he's saying here, is that this is talking about Israel being cut off and becoming dry bones. And so he's trying to twist this verse that is really pretty clear about a person being assigned to death with wicked men. And he can't really get things to line up, but he tries to do what he can there. And as we were saying earlier, people will believe what they want to believe. Okay, New Testament references, and I'm going to stop after this. So New Testament references to that verse that we were just reading. One of them comes from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22. And he says, for you are called to this, for even the Messiah died for our sake and left us this example, that you would walk in his steps. He who did no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. So again, without saying that he's quoting from Isaiah, he just quotes Isaiah. And so he's using those words there to say that the Messiah is a standard for each of us to walk toward. He's saying that you would walk in his steps, and he who did no sin. And so we should be striving towards doing no sin. And there was no deceit found in his mouth. And so we should be walking towards that, walking in the same steps of Jesus. And by saying walking, it doesn't mean that we should be that. It means that we should be working towards that. We can't ever be perfect. And so that's how he uses that prophecy from Isaiah. All right, we'll finish this off next week on Skype.